Hey everybody, Stereo Stan here. I hope you're doing good. In today's tutorial, we are going to make a bouncing ball animation, and we're going to do bouncing ball, and we're also going to do squash and stretch. And so this type of animation will be helpful if you're creating any kind of object. It doesn't have to be a sphere that you want to have bounce. And so let's get started. So the first thing I'm going to do is come up to the primitive shape rollout, and I'm going to grab a sphere. And I'm going to get my move tool, and I'm just going to move that up. And let's go to the object tab, and let's give this some more segments. So let's go to 80. And what we want to do is we want to have this sphere fall from the sky, hit the ground, squash, pop back up, and then go back up. And we'll have it bounce a few times. So what we want to have happen is we want to actually have this sphere squash from the top down. And so right now we can see the axis is in the middle. And in Cinema 4D R25, there's actually a way of moving this without collapsing down this shape. But we're going to just do that just in case you're using an older version. But what we want to do is we want to move this access point down to the bottom so it squashes from the top. So I'm going to go to this little menu right here so we can see this sphere from different views. And we're going to just look at the right view. And what we can do is click on our sphere, and we're going to click this little button right here, make editable. And so this made the sphere editable, and what we can do is grab this, enable access, and we're going to just move it down to the ground. I'm going to just scroll into my scroll wheel, move it down towards the bottom. Okay, and then I'm going to uncheck that. Sometimes I forget to uncheck that, and then I'm moving the axis around instead of the actual object. So just make sure you uncheck that. I'm going to click back up here to go back to our perspective view. And so now our axis is at the bottom of this. And so this will move up and down from the bottom. Okay. Okay, so let's start this up out of the screen. Just going to move it up so we don't see it anymore. And on the y-axis, I'm going to click that keyframe. So at 0, I want the sphere to start out of the frame, and then we're going to move forward in time. So depending on how fast you want your animation to go, you're going to put the keyframes closer or further apart. So I'm just going to go to 12, and you can choose any number that you feel like you'd like to try there if you want it to go faster or slower. I think 12 is a good starting point. And then we'll move it down. And I'll have it just hit the ground there. And I'm going to record that keyframe at 12, so it's going to just come and hit the ground. And so here's something that I found really important, is doing things in a certain order when we're planning out these animations. So for instance, we want this to hit the ground, and we want it to squash on the next keyframe, and then pop back up, and then move back up, versus hitting the ground and then slowly moving back up, because then we'll be squashing and moving at the same time, which would look really weird. So what we want to do is think about what we're trying to do. So hit the ground, squash, pop back up in the same Y position. So I'm going to record that same position 2 more times. And so what happens there is that basically means it will stay in the same Y position for 3 keyframes, and then we're going to go back up. So then I'll go back up, and we won't go back up as high. Record that, and then we'll come back down. And hit the ground right there. Record that position, and then we'll do the same thing. We'll record that same position a couple more times. And let's start with that. We might give this a little bit more bounce in a minute. So what we want to do is let's rewind that, let's hit play, let's just see what things are looking like. So pretty simple bounce movement. So here's a good time to adjust your timing and kind of dial that into what you like before we get into modifying the curves and before we get into modifying or adding in the squashing. And so if you don't like this movement, what you could do is you could grab these keyframes here. We could also grab the keyframes there, and we can just move these around. And so we can dial in the speed that we want. And so we can try a few different things out. And of course we can adjust these later, but this is a good stage to dial it in. It's pretty close to how you want it. all these. I'm going to actually move it back to closer to what I had. So this is what it's looking like without any adjusting the animation curves or anything like that. And so that's really going to make a big difference here. But let's jump in and let's actually also animate our squash. So let's rewind it. So let's get the sphere. And so what we're going to do to squash this is we are going to hit the ground and we're going to squash right there. So let's click on the sphere. And what we want to do is squash it on the Y. And we can see since we moved that anchor point to the bottom, it's going to squash from the top down. That's what we want. And so let's record a keyframe here at 1. That way it's not squashing as it's falling through the sky. So it's 1 for this whole part. Here we're going to go to 0.5. And the more or less you squash this, the more or less dramatic it's going to look. So you can adjust that to whatever you think would look the best. And then I'm going to go to the next one. I'm going to put to 1. So now we have it squash, pop back up. So let's rewind that. Let's just check that out. Okay, so it's happening pretty fast. And so we are actually going to spread out these keyframes just a little bit, but let's finish the other squashing over here. So we'll go up, hit the ground. Let's record 1 there. And let's squash it right there, 0.5. And I'll go back up to 1 right here. So same thing. So let's rewind that, check that out. Okay, so what we want to do is I'm going to just spread these out just a little bit here. And we could have done this at the beginning, but I like just to start and kind of see how things are looking right up front. We'll give it a little bit more time there, and I think that's looking a little bit better. So the next thing we need to do is get in there and start adjusting our curves, because that is where the magic happens. So let's adjust the curves of the sphere, and we're going to open that up. Let's start with our position, and then we'll go to the scale. So I'm going to open up the position, click on the Y. Right now we're in keyframe mode, which is right here. So we're going to go to curve mode. So now we can see our curves. And so with the curves, these are just the keyframes right here, these little orange cubes. So what's happening with the curves is it's starting out slow. So when this is horizontal, it's going slower. And when it's going vertical, it's going faster. And so we're starting slow, going faster, and then it's not going at all. It's just completely horizontal. And then we're going slow, slow, and faster at these points right here. So instead of starting slow at the beginning, I'm going to grab that keyframe and I'm just going to bend it down. And I am going to just start in linear. And since it's out of the frame, we won't really notice that yet, but we're just going to start with that. And so if your timeline gets messed up and you can't see things, just remember you can click the H key. It'll frame everything up. That's the same as clicking this button right here. And so part of the problem with our animation is a bounce animation. The curve actually doesn't really look like this when it bounces. And so what we need to do is we're going to grab that keyframe, and a bounce curve should look more like this. I'm going to grab that keyframe, and if I hold the shift key, I can break this tangent. So you can see this handle's only moving on one side, and that's what we want. So we're going to actually go up right here. So it's going the fastest right before it hits the ground. So we're getting more of a curve here, and it's not easing into that keyframe right there, if that makes sense. And actually, I'm going to grab this. I'm going to drag that up. We will do a little bit of easing there at the beginning. Let's just see what that looks like. Okay, so let's do that to the other places where the sphere hits the ground. So I'm going to hold shift, move that up. And that little adjustment is actually going to make a pretty big difference for our bounce animation. So whenever we're doing a bounce where something's hitting a solid thing like the ground, we want it to go the fastest right before it hits it, and we can do that by just holding shift. And let's check that out. Okay, so that's already looking a little bit better. And so we can now come in here and we can adjust this. And so when it's in the air, this is where our sphere is in the air, we can make that hang a little longer, and that just gives it a little bit of style. I don't know if you can notice how it's hanging longer, and if I pull these out, it's getting more and more extreme because it's really horizontal right there, so it's going to just stay in that position longer. So you can see it's kind of stalling in the air. I'm going to just move down a little bit, holding the 1 key, moving my camera. We might have to adjust the beginning there. And so now this curve, since we've given this more of a hang time there, this curve is not looking as nice. And so I'm just going to grab that and I'm just going to adjust that just so it looks less like it has a little bit of a kink in there. And let's see if that needs to be adjusted. And so the other thing is we can, just by looking at this curve, we can see that it's a little bit uneven, which is totally fine, but I'm just going to grab this and move this over and just see how that affects it, making our curve a little bit more uniform, if that makes sense. I don't know if that's the right word. Okay, and I'm going to grab this. I'm going to bring this up even more. I know I did the opposite at the beginning. Probably should have just left it kind of coming out like that, but. And let's also pause this for a second. Let's grab this, rewind it. Let's start this so it's out of the frame like we had at the beginning. I'll just record that. I'm going to click the H key so we frame up everything in here. So what we want to do now is we might come back and adjust this a little bit more, but I think that's looking pretty good. And so let's go to the scale and let's adjust our animation curve on the scale. And so right now it looks flat. And if I hit the H key, just because we are zoomed out, it'll zoom in there so we can really see what's happening. So here we can see what's happening with our squash. And as we bring this over, we see, oh, there we are, right? Caught up with the beginning of the squash. And so we're easing in a little bit on both ends. We're doing a little easing, and we don't really want that with the squash because the sphere is coming from the sky and it's coming down pretty quickly. So when we do our squash in, we want to make that so it's coming in pretty quick. So I'm just going to drag this down. So here it's going to come in squashing very quickly. And then I'm going to exaggerate that squash by just dragging it out a little bit. And I don't know if you've noticed, but sometimes when you're pulling these out, you can get this so it's not perfectly straight and you have to kind of get in there. So one thing you could do is click the 0 key and that just levels that out. I'll click H. And then for squashing out, we can actually have a little bit of that easing back out there. I think that'll look pretty good. So we're just easing right there. So let's check that out. So some of these things are really subtle, but they all kind of add up to make a pretty big difference. So we need to fix this squash right there. So let's grab this. I'm going to hold the Shift key. So it's kind of like the opposite of our position curve. And then let's exaggerate this one a little bit more. And so that's looking pretty good. So after this point, you could basically come in here and you can continue to adjust things. You can move around the timing. But as far as a basic squash animation, I think this is looking pretty good. Sometimes on my animations, I like to just even fine tune this last one a little bit more, just exaggerate this last scale up. And so I can grab this and I can move it over. And let's move it over even more. So when we pop back up at the end, it's actually just a little bit of a slower pop up. And I kind of like to have this happen quicker right when it hits down and then just slowly pops back up. I just like the way that looks. Of course, there's all kinds of different ways you could do that. Let me click the H key to frame everything. And I'm going to just grab this last keyframe and just bring that over just a little bit more. Click the 0 key to straighten that out. So there we go. So the last little touch that we could put into this animation if we wanted to is a little bit of stretching as it's falling. So let me pause this, rewind it. So as the sphere is coming down, we can stretch it just a little bit on the same axis here, the Y. And we'll just give it a little bit of a cartoon kind of movement. So as it's gaining speed, it's going to stretch just a little bit more to right there. So what we can do is increase this like that, and we can put that right behind there. Let's check that out, see how that looks. So that just gives it a little bit of an extra kind of fun movement. And so of course we want to kind of do the same thing right here. So as it's going up, hitting the ground, popping back up. And then when we get up to the top, what we can do is we can actually increase that stretch, and we can actually just have that stretch hang. And let's give that a shot. So to right there. So let's increase that a little bit right there. And we'll go to 1. And then as it's going back down, let's click 1. And then right when it hits right around here, we can have it go up. Let's go right there. And we'll do a little stretching right there. So now we've got this where it's doing a stretch right there, and then catching back up, and then holding, and then stretching as it goes down. So having this hold is really important. Without this, it does look a little weird, I've noticed. And now we can just adjust this a little bit. And so I think that's too quick. And I think that needs to ease in right there. So we want to ease into that stretching. And we can try to just make this stretching a little bit more abrupt right there. And it just gives it a little bit of a different look. It's almost like a jiggly kind of look. So you can do that, I think, either way. I found it looks pretty good. We can also try it on this end and see what kind of look that gives it. So I kind of like just this kind of bell curve right there the best. A little bit less. And so right at this point, it's just fine tuning it. But this is, I think, the fun part of doing these kind of animations is just trying out different things and experimenting with getting different looks. And let's see what happens if we just bring this over just a little bit. I'm going to hold the shift key just to make sure that stays in this position so I don't move it up or down a little bit by accident. And so I'm just going to hold shift. Let's just see what this looks like here. Sometimes I can't tell if I like it better. Or it eases in just a little bit, just maybe a little bit less than that. There we go. I think that looks pretty dang good. I hope this is helpful to you. One thing that you can do now is obviously grab a material and pause this, rewind it. Actually, let's go forward so we can see it. Just going to drag a material on there so we have some kind of color. And this should be all good to go to render. So if you're using the class template, all you have to do is come up to these render settings here, go to the save, give this a name, and give it a location to where you want to save it. Everything else should be set up for you if you're using the standard render, and it should render out at MP4. If you're using a different kind of renderer, then you can render that however you would like to, but everything else should be good to go. So you can close that, click this play button, and it'll take a few minutes and it'll render out your animation. Then you can check out the MP4. And in the next class, what we are going to do is do a jump up and flip animation. So that's going to be a lot of fun. So I will see you in that class.